At the dawn of South Africa's democracy, many countries on the continent had achieved independence, but many still languished in poverty, underdevelopment, and political instability. However, South Africa's agenda was to help turn around the narrative of the so-called dark continent as it pushed for unity, stability, progress, and importantly, integration. Has South Africa succeeded so far? Welcome to Democracy 30. My name is Oliver Dixon. It's an absolute honor and privilege being in your company this evening. In this episode, we ask, has South Africa successfully contributed to Africa's development in line with its Africa agenda? And joining us to discuss this is Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, the former chairperson of the African Union Commission. She also served as the Minister of Foreign Affairs in 1999, where she was leading the state's foreign policy on Africa and the world. First, we went out to the streets to hear your views about the role that South Africa plays and should play on the development of the continent. This is what South Africans had to say.
South Africa is more like a developed country, a developed country compared to all other African nations. The infrastructures in South Africa are more advanced, so it's more like, you see, the front page of Africa is South Africa.
Our plate is so full, our challenges are so many. Before Ritusako next door, I think let's prioritize Rona Pele, we are dealing with a lot.
We must assist other countries, nearby countries obviously, because we've been helping each other like from way back since 1994.
What are you going to achieve? You are just putting your country in a debt, a deeper debt, and once you are in a debt, my enemy is your enemy.
As a country that has committed into a number of responsibilities, such as being part of the SADC, we are responsible to contribute in a number of aspects.
South Africa has a responsibility to South Africa first. They should stop concentrating in other countries. That is why our country is disintegrating.
We're all Africans, and like our country has grown, we can help support others in their growth. So I feel our finances, our infrastructure, and everything that we've got, we can pass down in building a stronger Africa.
South Africa because how South Africa
it's got a responsibility to help other African countries, but firstly, they need to sweep their own doors, which is South Africa.
And welcome to the conversation. Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, thank you so much for joining us. Really do appreciate it. Perhaps to start the conversation here, take us all the way back to the early 90s, the late 80s, when the incoming government of the time started to think about its role as a government, and particularly its role on the continent. One can understand that a great deal of our freedom is due to the sacrifices that our partners on the continent had made. But what was the thinking and the conceptualization into what South Africa's role will be on the continent as a democratic state?
I think we must go back to the continent. What was the continent thinking about us, and therefore what should we have thought and what did we think about the continent? I'll take you back to 1945. In 1945, the Pan-Africanists met in Manchester at a conference, and they decided that Africa must be decolonized within 50 years, right? The whole of Africa must be decolonized within 50 years. Then they started putting structures together. That's why the OAU was formed. That's why the liberation committees were established and so on, because they had a vision of decolonizing Africa. Not one country, not two countries, Africa as a continent. Did they achieve that? Other than Western Sahara, Africa was decolonized within 50 years. South Africa was decolonized on the 49th year. Because if we take South Africa alone and not take it as part of what was going on the continent, we will go wrong. So on the 49th year, South Africa was the last one to be decolonized. Right. South Africa itself, from the days of, from the ANC side in particular, had its Freedom Charter, for instance. What did the Freedom Charter say about our relationships with the continent, with our neighboring countries? It says there shall be peace and friendship. Of course, development and other things, but mainly peace and friendship. So it charts the path on which we should move. We can't be hostile.
Have we stuck to
the
that?
Continent. May I finish?
Sure.
We must not be hostile to the continent. There shall be peace and friendship. Where there is no peace, it says we must not, we must solve the problems through conflict resolution, through negotiations, not through war. So already it gave us an indication of where we should go. When Madiba in '94 went to his first summit as the president of South Africa, he made an analogy in his speech of the destruction of Carthage, because the meeting was in Tunisia. Carthage is in Tunisia. And said, now it's time to rebuild. But he also was referring to what apartheid was doing on the continent. It was destroying. It was attacking countries, killing freedom fighters in Lesotho, in Mozambique, everywhere. So he was saying, now South Africa is going to be seen and must act in a way that builds. Right? And he said, if freedom was the crown that the freedom fighters put on Africa, the jewel must be the happiness, the comfort of its people. So that was what was said. And of course, you could see, even from the time Madiba took over, that he was making sure that we integrate not only in SADC, but into the continent. So you wanted to ask a question?
So peace and friendship is the guiding principle, and it seems to be a foreign policy guiding principle of South Africa till today. Of course, when it comes to conflict, there's a very stern stance on non-alignment. But generally speaking, on the continent, have we stuck to the principles of peace and friendship as a guiding principle in our foreign policy interactions across Africa?
Yes, we have. We have. Let me take you back. When there was a conflict in Burundi, for instance, Madiba, after the passing away of President Nyerere, who was in charge, who was the main person in resolving that conflict, President Mandela had to then take over. And South Africa basically had to take over. And we even contributed a big contingent of troops for peacekeeping in Burundi under the first AU peacekeeping mission. There were 3 countries that were there. South Africa had the biggest contingents. Then there was Ethiopia and there was Mozambique. Later on, that mission was then turned into a UN mission. I'm just saying, yes, we've stuck to peace and friendship on the continent right from the start of our democracy. We have been involved in negotiations and resolving many conflicts on the continent. Not only Burundi. We were part of the initial, the DRC negotiations. They even came here to Sun City to negotiate. And those negotiations led to their
secession.
Yeah, it led to them having elections. We were involved even in the Comoros. When there was a conflict there, we were part of resolving that in Côte d'Ivoire, which is in West Africa. We were part of negotiating for peace there. In Sudan, South Sudan. So we have stuck to that right through. It's not only during Madiba or during Mbeki, right through. President Cyril Ramaphosa, before he became president, he was in charge of the conflict resolution in South Sudan. So South Africa has stuck to that, I would say. There is no completion date.
Right.
It's work in progress, because wherever we need to do something, we have to do it. We can't say we've successfully done it. It's ongoing work.
I want to ask you this question twofold. One, as a South African minister, and later on again as the chairperson of the AU Commission. What has been the biggest impediment to the rebuilding project that Madiba spoke about in Tunisia? In the biggest impediment in achieving peace and friendship, perhaps even stability, where it was needed the most on the continent? In the instances where you were part of those negotiating teams, what did you find to be the most difficult?
Well, if you're talking about negotiating in conflict, one of the things that I even said in one of the meetings, the problem when we negotiate, men tend to talk about power sharing. Who wants to share power? I even said we need to call it responsibility. Because once you say power sharing, then it becomes very difficult to negotiate who must do what, who must take what, who must lead. But if people understand that this is a responsibility towards our country, and we need, when you have a responsibility, you need hands to help you. But if you have power, you don't want to share it. So sometimes that's the most difficult part when it comes to what they call power sharing. But I think we should not define the continent only around conflicts.
Right.
Because the continent must not just be dealing with conflicts. Yes, there must be peace. But there can't be, you can't sustain peace if there's no development. And you can't sustain development if there's no peace. If you have a country that seems relatively stable, but there's no development in that country, young people are unemployed, they have no stake in the future of the country, women are not integrated in the economy, they are being abused and so on.
Yeah.
You will not maintain that stability forever. At some stage, there'll be instability, because if you have people who are young minds who are idle, who don't see where the future is, you can come, anyone can come and say, I'll give you some euros a day, take this gun. They will take it.
Right.
So to maintain peace, you also have to make sure
that there's development.
That there's development.
Yeah. Let's talk about development.
Yes.
And we're going to get into some key developmental priorities especially during your tenure as chairperson at the African Union Commission. But before we do that, let's take a break. I'm in conversation with Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma. Don't go away. This is Democracy 30. And welcome back to Democracy 30. Tonight we ask the question, has South Africa successfully, over the last 30 years, been able to make sure that its Africa agenda has come to fruition? I'm in conversation with Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, who in 1999 was the Minister of Foreign Affairs and had served subsequent to that in various positions in South African government, but also as the chairperson of the African Union Commission. Let's talk about development. Yes. And there's a very specific document that you led and I guess co-authored as a result of that, Agenda 2063. It outlined development goals. In the 1950s, you said, when African leaders met in Manchester, they said, together we must agree that we will all become decolonized in 50 years. Agenda 2063 was again such a moment where we said, this is what the continent must look like over this period of time. What are the key developmental targets that we as a continent have set for ourselves, and what role has South Africa played in making sure that we drive that? Yeah, I would assume the Continental Free Trade Area would be one of those.
Yes. I think with development, we must look at what do we have to develop our continent? Because you can only develop it with what you have. Our most precious resource that we must invest in is our people. It's the people. Because you can have gold, you can have everything, but people must turn that into wealth. So our young people, women, everyone must be skilled, because there are no non-skilled jobs anymore.
Right.
We need to skill our young people. In 2050, Africa's population will be about 2.5 billion. That will be about a quarter of the world's population.
Right.
The majority of them will be young. The biggest labor force will be on this continent. So we need to skill the young people so that they can drive development. Who's going to drive development if we don't skill the young people? We must skill them, especially in the science, in technology, in the engineering, in maths, research, innovation. They need to be there. When they need to be healthy, they need to be skilled. Right. Then from there, we look at what we should do. We should industrialize. All our countries, the entire continent, we must industrialize. Over the years, there's been a tendency towards de-industrialization. We need to industrialize because we need to manufacture. We have resources on this continent. Let me start with the most basic resource, land. Africa has 60% of available arable land in the world. If you take all available arable land in the world, 60% of it is on our continent. But the paradox is that we're spending billions of dollars importing food instead of growing food, feeding ourselves as a continent, and even assisting to feed the world. So that must change. We must make sure that we are able to feed ourselves. That's one of the goals that we have set ourselves.
Yeah.
Secondly, we have natural resources. But even the agricultural products, we produce cotton.
All right.
But what do we do with our cotton?
We don't have much of a textile industry.
Most of it is sent outside. And then we import fabric and cotton and, finished goods. Egypt maybe is one of the few countries that beneficiate its cotton. That's why we have Egyptian linen. We produce probably more than 70% of world's cocoa. But we send it outside. And our children on the continent can't afford the chocolates. So I'm very happy that Ghana has started making chocolates. We produce timber, but we send logs outside. And we import furniture. So industrialization is central. Before we even go to the minerals.
Are we driving, and here I just want to come back to the role of South Africa in achieving that, especially as the largest market and economy on the continent. Are we driving the right policy conversations continent-wide? And has the African Union played its role in making sure that the relevant stakeholders on the continent adopt the right policies and have the right conversations to drive an industrial agenda, industrialization agenda, but also make sure that there's a skilling of the young people, as you said, and to make sure that they're healthy?
Yes. I don't think we're doing enough, even in this country. I think we should do more. I think all countries need to do more. Because if we were doing enough on the continent, we wouldn't be seeing people trying to cross the Mediterranean and dying there. Because they are going, looking for greener pastures. They are going out of our continent, not out of choice, but out of desperation. So we're not doing enough. We wouldn't be seeing so much unemployment everywhere if we were doing enough. So, yes, we're doing something, but I would say not enough. We must do more. We must change. There is something we call the African paradox. Maybe you know it. It's a rich Africa and poor Africans. We have everything that other continents used to develop themselves, but we haven't used those things to develop ourselves. Our minerals, we send minerals out of our countries raw, right? When you send anything raw, you're not only sending that, we are exporting jobs. You are exporting revenue. Because by the time that comes back as a finished good, maybe you won't afford it. So one of the presidents, President Seven, likes saying, Africa is the biggest donor of jobs and revenue. I mean, until recently, some of the oil-producing countries were importing fuel because they were not doing anything to their crude oil.
Yeah.
So one of the things that document talks about is doing all those things, beneficiating, manufacturing, and of course, Africa is the only continent that does not trade with itself. Our percentage of trade within the continent is nothing more than 50%. Maybe when it goes up, in some areas it may be 20-something percent.
Yeah.
But if you look at other continents, it will be more than 50%. If you ask any country in other continents, who is your largest trading partner? They will not point at people across the oceans.
Their neighbors.
They'll point at their neighbors. But us will be pointing at people across the oceans. So even that needs to change. That's why we have the continental free trade
area.
But the continental free trade area, the agreement has been signed and it's there, but it won't succeed if we don't manufacture, because what do we trade?
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for. We've run out of time, and there's so many more themes to touch on, but we're going to have to leave it there. Dr. Nkosazana Dlamini-Zuma, thank you so much for your time. Really do appreciate it. And that's it for this episode of Democracy 30. I'm back with you next week. You and I can continue the conversation on all our platforms. You can find me on X. It is @Oliver_speaking. But for now, from myself and the team, it's good night. Cheers.